Okay, so we go on with the next session and actually the next keynote by Dorsa Sadigh. So hello, Dorsa. Thank you for joining us and presenting today. Dorsa is assistant professor at Stanford, as we already see from this slide here, and is working on HRI, but also on AI learning techniques, let's say, and I think has done several contributions to modeling already. And here she will report on those in her talk. So we're looking forward to that. And I hand over to you. Thank you for being there.
All right, sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Really excited to be here. Yeah, and let me get started. So in general, in my lab, I'm pretty interested in developing algorithms for autonomous systems and robots that can work well with humans, coordinate with humans. And through that, we try to build quite a bit of we try to work on building computational models of humans. And this is just to understand humans and do partner modeling. But a lot of times it is also to understand what are human preferences or reward functions or policies, so we can have better robotics algorithms that can do various types of tasks. So the talk today is going to be focused on the second category. Like, we are learning human models, not necessarily for the sake of interaction, but to basically have better robotic systems that could use those human models, human preferences, human reward functions to more effectively learn from humans and be able to do those tasks. And today what I want to do is I want to talk specifically about a project or a couple of projects that fall into the category of learning human models from non-traditional sources of data. All right, so let's just get into this. So about a year ago, actually, let me play this a little later. About a year ago, we started working on this problem of assistive feeding, and I'm very excited about this problem. It's one of those problems that is very close to my heart. And the reason I like this problem is it's a very interesting robotics problem, like picking up the food and thinking about the transfer of the food inside of the person's mouth. That is a pretty interesting robotics problem, but it's also a very difficult interaction problem. There's a person sitting there interacting with this robot and providing forces on the food. And that is a pretty exciting domain to be in. So we have a thread of work on this, but our very first attempt was to reproduce some of the baselines that is out there for assistive feeding. And what I'm showing here is a video of this robot basically trying to follow a fixed pose policy. So this is a hand design policy, no learning. Like, this is just basically trying to like go to a fixed pose that is predefined before. I think it does have visual servoing. That's like to the extent of like intelligence of this algorithm. And as you can see, like, it's not very comfortable. This person like has to like back out for the food to get to their mouth. And the robot like ends up in this like really like weird configuration at the end. They're like, it's not very comfortable, like being able to like take a bite off of this food following this baseline policy. So at this point, we thought maybe we could use ideas around learning and try to understand how this robot should feed a person. And one idea was maybe we should use reinforcement learning. And we shouldn't be using reinforcement learning in this domain. Part of the reason is that if we were to use reinforcement learning, we either need to have really good simulators out there that could simulate a human's mouth and food and all of that, and we don't really have that today. And we can't really run reinforcement learning on the real robot and try to like get negative signals when the food is like hitting the person's face. Like, this is the most safety critical application I have worked on like during my career in robotics. And I don't think it makes sense to run reinforcement learning here. So the other idea is maybe we should learn from demonstrations, right? Maybe we can collect expert demonstrations and then learn from those expert demonstrations. That seems to be a reasonable approach. But it turns out that in this domain, you need actually a lot of expert demonstrations to be able to do anything reasonable. And it's actually pretty difficult to use expert demonstrations here as well. So we have a bunch of work that tries to combine learning and model-based approaches to address this problem. But the point that I want to get across here is that it turns out that it's pretty difficult to tap into expert demonstrations or reinforcement learning to try to do this task. And at some point, we started asking ourselves, well, how is it that we learn how to eat as a child? Like how do humans learn how to eat as a child? And the first thing that might come to our mind could also be expert demonstrations. Like we all probably had someone, like a parent, who tried to teach us how to take a bite off of food, like take a kind of bite of a spaghetti and bring it to our mouth, either through kinesthetic teaching, maybe moving our hands, or maybe showing us how to do it. And it is true that expert demonstrations in general is a very rich source of data. But I'd like to argue that it's not just expert demonstrations that we rely on. I'd like to argue that oftentimes we rely on many other sources of data that maybe we don't talk about as much. In practice, we rely on so many other sources of data, such as observing suboptimal agents, right? Like we might look at like other people and how they are like eating spaghetti, and maybe they're not good at it either. But by observing that, we start building ideas about how we should pick up the food. So that's one source of data that I feel like it's underused quite often when we're thinking about learning models of humans or learning robot algorithms when we are looking at human data. Another source of data that I think is really powerful is unstructured play, right? Like if you look at like us humans, right, a lot of times we might have like played with our food, and that teaches us the dynamics of the food and the state space, and it gives us so much information about the food that we wouldn't normally get just from expert demonstrations. And in addition to that, you might be looking at comparisons, right? Like there is kind of like a difference between a good bite and a not so great bite that's slippery and the food falls off it. And then we start making these comparisons and reasonings of why is one a good bite and why is one not such a great bite. And these comparisons are also a pretty powerful source of data. So the thing I'd like to argue is that this obsession with like expert demonstrations is maybe holding us back. And in practice, we should rely on other sources of data beyond expert demonstrations. For example, suboptimal demonstrations, unstructured play, or comparisons. So today, what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about learning from suboptimal demonstrations. And I would like to maybe given time, I might spend a little bit of time thinking about unstructured play and comparison, but I think I would probably go deeper in this idea of learning from suboptimal demonstrations. And I'd like to argue that this idea of relying on these other sources of data, it's also pretty useful when it comes to robotics applications. So this is how humans learn how to eat. But again, going back to this robotics problem that I was showing, right? Like in this robotics problem, as I was arguing earlier, collecting expert demonstrations is extremely limiting because they're difficult to collect, both in the case of like feeding, but also in other settings, it's not that easy to collect these demonstrations. So oftentimes we end up relying on collecting expert demonstrations in different tasks or domains, or robots with different morphologies, or robots in simulation. And there is kind of that transfer issue that we need to deal with when we start relying on expert demonstrations from these other domains. So in practice, in robotics as well, we have all these other sources of data that we should really tap into beyond expert demonstrations. And these sources of data, as I was mentioning earlier, the ones I would like to talk about today are suboptimal demonstrations from humans, unstructured play, as well as comparisons between two different ways of doing a task. There are also other sources of data that we're exploring in my lab, like including videos and language in kind of like the recent, like last 6 months or so, but I'm not going to be talking about those today. All right, so let's just get into it. So how can we learn from a mixture of demonstrators with varying expertise level? I'm going to abstract out the problem a little bit. So the setup we are in is a setup where we have, let's say, humans with different levels of expertise. And these humans are, or maybe robots with various levels of expertise, and they're going to give us data, some level of data. And from this data, we would like to learn a policy in an offline fashion. And this is the usual imitation learning paradigm, or you might think of offline RL, like, which is fairly popular these days, as another paradigm of learning from this data. But I want to emphasize two core differences that we have here. The first difference is that, first off, we are in a full-on imitation learning paradigm where we have access to no reward information. So unlike offline RL, we don't assume that reward information is collected. And in addition, we don't have any access to an environment dynamics. We can't do rollouts of policies and see what happens. It's just like offline data. It's that data we collected and then we go with that. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, this data could come from suboptimal agents. So we might have novice players, intermediate players, or expert players. And then based on the data we're getting from all of them together, we would like to be able to leverage that data and learn from that data. All right. Okay, so how should we do that? So the big problem here is that we have agents with different expertise, and we actually don't have any ground truth label for that expertise. And ideally, we should have a way of inferring that expertise. So let's try to formalize this a little bit more. So I'm going to refer to rho as a way of referring to this expertise of each one of these agents that we have, again, novice, intermediate, or expert players. And rho here captures how skilled someone is in this particular scenario. So we can think of rho as probability of succeeding in a task. So if it is closer to 0, you have a novice player. If it is closer to 1, you have an expert player. And this rho value, this expertise, can be varied depending on the scenario we are in. So it's very scenario dependent or state dependent. So let's look at a particular scenario. Let's say we want to identify the color of a given shape. So this is a very abstract example. I have shapes, different shapes, and then I want to identify the color. And if I have an expert player, the expert player is going to say, well, this is red. And I might have suboptimal players or novice players that might just think this is brown. And in general, I might have states of different shapes and colors, and the correct action is to tell what is the color of these states. So the reason I'm going over this very concrete example is I want to explain what our algorithm does on this example, and then show you how it extends to the real robotics domain. So on this particular example, right, like we have a number of states, we have a number of players, they have a number of expertise values. And for a second, let's assume that we actually have the ground truth label, meaning that we know exactly what the expertise level of each one of these agents are. Okay, so if that is the expertise level, I'm going to fill up this table with that expertise level, meaning that I have an expert who correctly identifies all the colors. I have a novice player who incorrectly identifies none of the colors. And then I have some intermediate players that with some percentage are identifying the right colors. So what can I do with this data? If this is my data set, well, one thing that I can do, maybe the most naive thing I can do, is to do majority vote, right? Like people are telling me they're telling me actions. Again, remember, actions here is just identifying the color. They're giving me actions. And the question is, what action should I follow? And I can just do majority vote, and then based on majority vote, move forward. But majority vote obviously is going to fail here because these experts are not at the same level of expertise. So for this last row, if the novice player and this intermediate player at 20%, if both of them are saying, well, the color of this circle is brown, I'm going to rely on what they are saying and kind of ignore what my expert said because I'm just going with majority. But in practice, if I do have access to these row values, instead of majority vote, it would make sense to do a weighted vote, right? It would make sense for me to look at these expertise levels and then weight weight the actions that are coming from each one of these agents, and then do a weighted vote that would actually give me the right value of action for this last column. And the reason for that is, again, my expert player is an expert at expertise level 1, and that is greater than the sum of expertise of all these other agents. So I'm going to heavily rely on what that expert player says. Okay, so this was the case when we have ground truth label. But in practice, we don't have ground truth label. In practice, we are in a setting where these rows are gone, right? Like I don't really know what the rows are. So the question is, what should we do and how should we approach this problem? So our algorithm does something similar to this. What it does is it says, well, I don't have the rows, so that's fine. Maybe I'll just do majority vote first. And based on majority vote, I'm going to get some action, some policy that's going to tell me what to do in these states. And then once I have the policy, maybe I can go back and I can actually assign values to these rows based on what the policy has given me. So the policy has given me these values. I'm going to go back and then assign a new row value for each one of these agents. I realize, oh, this was actually a novice player. So that's 20, because this player only got 20% of things correct, assuming majority vote is doing the right thing. And then this is an intermediate player and so on. I'm going to assign the right values of rows. So at this point, I have a number of weights. They're not the correct weights, but I can continue and I can actually do a weighted sum with these new weights. And that is going to give me a whole new policy. And that whole new policy is now going to give me the correct value of black, because now with this new policy, I identified that this guy is an expert. I incorrectly think this is an only 80% expert. But even if it is an 80% expert, I'm going to trust what they tell me in terms of what to do in this particular row. And that's how I end up with black. And then I go back and I update my row values accordingly. And I eventually converge to the true row value. So this was just a quick example to give you an idea of what the algorithm is trying to do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to do imitation learning, and imitation learning in a setting where we have agents with varying levels of suboptimality, that is coming from a large offline data set. And the way we are actually fixing the problem is by leveraging information about the demonstrator identities. The fact that I know who the demonstration is coming from is helping me to identify how much of an expert they are over time. And then that helps me to actually be able to learn from them, even if they're not an expert. That's kind of the key idea that we are using here. there's quite a bit of bells and whistles that goes on. So let me try to add some of those bells and whistles. So I've been talking about this notion of state. You can think of the expertise to be something that is fully state dependent. Like, for example, if you look at this intermediate player is a full-on expert when it comes to identifying the colors for a square, but is actually going to have some trouble when it comes to identifying the color when it comes to circles. So instead of just saying that, oh, this is an expert at 60%, what I can do is I can assign a vector, and that vector has d dimensions, and each one of these dimensions is going to depend on what particular skill we are in. Like, are we in a skill that corresponds to identifying colors in a square, or is it identifying skills in a circle? So how do we identify that? Well, we need to have some set of task embeddings. And this is pretty common, like what we are doing here. So there's nothing novel going on here. But what we are basically doing is we are looking at these different skills that you might have. So you might have a setting where you're identifying colors from easy to hard, or you might identify shapes from easy to hard. And then you basically have a space here, and you can define a task embedding, f of phi parameterized by phi, that takes a state and outputs a vector, a d-dimensional vector, where d is the number of skills that you might have. And then basically, if you pick any of these states, like the red square or the brown triangle, we're going to have a vector that identifies the task embedding of them, and how difficult or how proficient the human needs to be for this particular skill. So going back to defining my row, right? Like, I've defined this row, this expertise, as just a number so far. I haven't told you how to compute that row. So the way we compute that row, it depends on two things. One is this task embeddings, like how difficult is this task? How relevant each skill is in solving a task? And then the second one is how proficient the human is in that particular task. And what we do is we define our row, that probability of succeeding, to be kind of an inner product of these two, the inner product of the task and the skill vector. And we take a sigmoid on top of it to get a probability. So you can imagine that if the skill and our task embedding, if they're aligned, if our skills are really good, if our skills are really good for those particular task embeddings, that inner product is going to be fairly positive. And then when you take the sigmoid on top of it, you're going to get an expertise level that is close to 1, which is like what we really want. And then if they're uncorrelated, then that inner product is fairly negative, and we're going to get an expertise level that's closer to 0 after taking the sigmoid, and that is going to give us a lower expertise. So it's just a detail on how to compute that row. And once I have that row, then I can talk about policies, right? That row, again, is the sigmoid of inner product of these two vectors. And then my policy is going to be probability of succeeding that row if I'm taking the correct action, and otherwise I'm uniformly assuming that the person is taking an incorrect action, any of them. All right. Let me skip some of these details. Let me just show you again, like maybe pictorially, what is happening. So pictorially, what's happening is I have a state and action from my data set. And our algorithm, IEEE, imitation learning by estimating the expertise of demonstrators, what it does is it first off takes a state. It generates a state embedding, a task embedding out of that. So we have this f of phi. We need to learn phi. But once we learn phi, we are going to have a task embedding. And we're going to have a skill embedding that, again, is being learned. And together with f and omega, we're going to be able to compute what rho is. Rho is just the sigmoid of the inner product of these two. That's all what rho is. And remember, rho was that expertise that earlier I was just treating it as a number. And then we have our current estimate of the policy. And together, right, like all of these are going to define what my policy should be. And I'm going to have a loss function here that I can optimize. And this loss function is just maximizing the log likelihood of my joint likelihood of my data set. So this loss function is parameterized by theta, which is the parameters of my expertise, and phi and omega, which are the things that are, theta is the parameters of my policy, and phi and omega, which are kind of parameterizing my expertise. Remember, rho is just parameterized by those. And all I'm doing, like all this approach is doing, is that given a mixture of demonstrators with varying levels of expertise, we are designing this imitation learning algorithm that maximizes the joint likelihood of policy and expertise at the same time. Okay. All right, so let me show you how this works in practice. So what are the benefits of this? So now the idea is I have an algorithm that can actually learn from suboptimal demonstrations, agents with different expertise. And we are showing that working across 3 different domains. So the first domain is this mini grid domain where we have different environments running. And we have two other domains, robotics domain coming from this RoboMimic data set from Stanford Vision Lab, as well as a chess domain where we're looking at real human chess data. So in these two domains, you're looking at real human data. In the first domain, you're looking at synthetic data, so synthetically generated data. So the first domain, the mini grid domain, we are looking at 4 different versions of this. We have an agent, so that's our ego agent is the red triangle here. It has partial observability. It's trying to get to the green goal. In the empty case, it's just an empty grid. It needs to find the goal. In the lava case, we need to avoid the lava. In the obstacle case, we have moving obstacles, and we need to avoid those moving obstacles. And then in the unlock case, this is a sparse reward situation where we need to find the key and then go open the door and get to the other location. So the way we are generating experts is by pre-training policies using reinforcement learning, and those give us expert behaviors. Again, this is synthetically generated experts, no human data here. And then the way we are kind of making our experts suboptimal is by adding uniform noise to their data. All right, so let's see how this works in practice. So here I'm looking at 10 different experts or 10 different agents. 9 of them are noise, and 1 of them is an expert. And we're looking at a setting where we have 5 experts and 5 noise, all experts, and when expertise like of different agents has varying levels. So this is what the row value shows, like here in each row. And we are looking at the empty domain and obstacle domain. So empty domain is the easier domain. You're looking at behavioral cloning, generative adversarial imitation learning, and IEEE, which is our algorithm. In the empty domain, we expect this to just like work fine across all the algorithms, which is actually the case. Like everything has like a fairly high success rate. In the obstacle domain, that is a domain that we are going to start seeing some difficulty when we are looking at Gale or behavioral cloning. They're going to suffer because they rely on these noisy data and they don't know how to differentiate the noisy data from non-noisy data. But IEEE is actually able to successfully learn from this mixture of demonstrations with varying levels of expertise. All right, so the kind of message here is that IEEE can learn which experts are good and use this expertise signal to learn a better policy and recover a better policy. In addition, I mentioned this idea of task embedding and state dependencies, and I haven't really shown that yet. So in the same domain, what we can do is we can have agents who are experts in a particular domain. So maybe I have an expert in an agent who's an expert in an empty domain, or an agent who's an expert in the lava domain or obstacle domain or unlock domain. And what I can do is I can generate a data set of all of these agents who are actually like experts for like their particular task, but they're pretty noisy for all the other tasks. And the question is, could I rely on this data set and could I learn from that? So let's look at some of the results there. So beta here is representing the experts, like the value of the expert. If beta is 1, everyone is expert in everything. So that's what this plot is showing. Everyone's expert in everything. And if you're using behavioral cloning on all the demonstrations or behavioral cloning on the best demonstrations or demonstration or IEEE, all of them are performing very well. Then what we're going to do is we're going to reduce beta. Like we're going to reduce beta. And as we reduce beta to like 50%, what that means is each one of these agents are going to be expert in their own domain and 50% of an expert in other domains. We're going to see the results going down for all the other algorithms, except for IEEE, who is still going to do very well, like 70% success rate, even when beta is like 0.001, which is pretty surprising. All right. So the message here is that IEEE can learn which states an expert is good at and use the state dependency of expertise signal to learn a better policy. Okay, so let me show you this couple of experiments a little quickly. I see I'm running out of time too. So then we started looking at this RoboMimic data set. So here we are looking at actual human data. So this is collected human data of 50 demonstrations for 6 players. So we have a worse set of demonstrators who are not good at this task, okay demonstrators, and better demonstrators. Again, this is a data set that is collected by this RoboMimic data set from Stanford Vision Lab. And what we do is we compare IEEE with BCRNN, which is behavioral cloning, and adding an RNN layer on top of it, which is a very good baseline because it kind of captures the history. And there's work that shows that BCRNN is outperforming a lot of fancy offline neural algorithms. And we're also comparing with IRIS, which is an offline neural algorithm. And you can notice that when we're using all of our demonstrations, right, like all of these demonstrations, BCRNN is actually performing fairly well, but at the same level as IEEE. And then when we're starting to look at like all these other demonstrations of varying levels of expertise, iLead is also outperforming the baselines. So even if, for example, we are looking at the case where we are only relying on the worst demonstrator, we are still able to see like fairly high success rates here. All right, let me skip this and just show you the chess example. And then the final example that I want to show here is a chess example. So here we decided to rely on a real data set of chess playing. So these are chess players at ELO rating of like 1,000 to 2,000. And then we've looked at basically like chess end games, like when there are only like pawns and kings on the board. So this is kind of like the end game situation that we have, and we have a data set that has around 1 billion state in action. So lots of data that exists here. And again, we have ELO ratings of 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000. And these are again real chess players, data from real chess players. And what we wanted to do here was to be able to recover this expertise. So we are not trying to find a policy here. We're just trying to recover the expertise, these ELO ratings. And we show that again, using iLead, we are able to recover the expertise level, like the expertise percentile goes down as you're looking at these different expertise levels at the true ELO ratings. It is really difficult to actually recover a full-on policy for this chess game, because we try to recover the full-on policy, but it's just low performance for any algorithm because we're assuming no access to dynamics, no access to rewards. So playing chess turns out to be pretty difficult if you're just relying on a few expert demonstrations. So learning a policy ends up being pretty difficult here, but at least we are able to identify these expertise. So iLead can also use these extracted expertise signals to estimate the ground truth competence of demonstrations. So just to summarize what I've talked about so far, and I know I'm running out of time, we've talked about imitation learning and the fact that imitation learning shouldn't just rely on expert demonstrations, but we could potentially do imitation learning and learn these computational models of humans when we are looking at multiple demonstrators with varying levels of expertise. And the approach that we are describing here, iLead, what it does is it figures out which demonstrations have higher levels of expertise using the state dependency, a notion of state dependency. And based on that, it's able to learn a better policy. So it optimizes the joint likelihood of expertise as well as the parameters of the policy. And it's also able to identify ground truth expertise level, like as we saw in the chess game. All right, so this was kind of the first source of data that I wanted to talk about. I don't have time to go into details around these, but I'm just going to very briefly mention this idea of learning from play and also learning from comparisons. So in addition to suboptimal demonstrations, one other source of data that's really powerful is play data, human play data, like unstructured play data. And that's something that we've started looking at. And the reason that is very powerful is it's very cheap to collect. So we can have like an easy, like that addresses the scalability problem that we often have when we're collecting expert demonstrations. And in addition to that, we can have a broad state action coverage, and that addresses the generalizability problem that we often have. So if you look at play data and coverage of play data, it turns out that play data has a lot more state action coverage compared to expert demonstrations or random actions. And as you increase this is just the same plot over 8 hours. And it's just very much significant when you start looking at play data. So we have a new algorithm that tries to look at play data and effectively learn from play data, learn policies from play data. And our algorithm, what it does is it basically thinks about making contacts with the object, and it takes an object-centric perspective to basically be able to learn from an interaction phase of play data. And by learning from an interaction phase of the play data, we can have more informative samples from play and more effectively learn internal the biases that people have in their data and be able to learn from that. And we've kind of demonstrated that working both on actual human play data and scripted play data, like synthetically generated play data on a number of primitives like pushing, pulling, lifting, and tipping. So we showed that this algorithm, Play-Doh, outperforms state-of-the-art learning from play methods. So if you're interested in this, I can talk about this offline, but I just want to mention the play data real quick. And then finally, the last form of data that I think is really interesting and powerful is learning from comparisons. So these might seem to not be that informative, but it turns out that they're very easy to collect. So what I mean by that is what we can do is, instead of bringing in a person, asking a person to provide a whole new data point for us, a whole new demonstration or play, what we can do is we can get the robot to generate 2 different demonstrations, and then ask a person, hey, can you compare A and B? Which one is better? Is A better or B better? And based on those simple binary questions, we can actually identify what human preferences are, and we can build models of human preferences. So we have a whole thread of work around active learning of human preferences. My student Erdem Beek, who's actually on the job market this year, has built his thesis around this, and he has quite a bit of work thinking about distinguishable preferences, how to make sure that these preferences are easy for humans to answer, and how to effectively learn from them. Just a quick peek of some of the things that he has looked at. So he's actually demonstrated that this idea of active preferences can be quite powerful when we are even learning nonlinear rewards, like Gaussian process rewards. And he has demonstrated in collaboration with folks at Caltech that you could use these type of queries to learn walking preferences, like people's gait preferences when they're walking. And with that, I'd like to thank the group, and I can also take any questions. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Dorsa, also for keeping time in mind. I think one question is possible. Is there anybody having a question?
So I see that there is a question actually on chat.
There is, you're right, there was one on the chat. Maybe you can answer that directly. That was asking for whether that assumes normal distribution and how it would work without normal distribution, let's say. So the IEEE example, I think.
Yeah, we are not assuming normal distribution. It actually does not assume anything about the distribution of the expertise levels, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily. Go ahead.
It seems like at the very beginning, when you don't originally know the expertise levels, but then you take the group average, and then you go back and try to find the expertise levels. To me, that sort of is assuming that the average will be indicative of the correct answer. So it doesn't.
But you're updating that, right? Like you're updating that. So basically, based like it's not necessarily making actually. So if you look at some of the experiments that I was showing, like we actually had a case where we had 9 demonstrators that are fully noisy, right? Like, and 1 demonstrator that is an expert. So the only assumption which we haven't formalized, and we should be formalizing that we are making, is having like a relatively good like state action coverage. And that is really like the assumption that is kind of like intuitively underlying this method. But we're not making any assumptions about like being better than average or anything of that form.
Okay, Serge has another one. Thank you.
Yeah, so this might be a really naive question, but I was wondering, like, so 2 things actually. Like the question 1 is, how many experts do you need for this to work? Like, I guess if I just have 1 person, then it's probably going to be difficult to figure out, right, whether they're an expert or not, potentially, but we can still look at how they do with the task and so on. And the second thing is, what happens if there are like multiple completely different but equally valid strategies for achieving a task, and what do we then learn? Like you had this beautiful pasta example, and I'm thinking of like eating pasta like an Italian versus eating noodles like they do in Asia, right? And what do you learn then?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Okay, hold on, I forgot your first question because I was thinking about your second question. So your first question of one demonstrator. Yeah, so, or like how are we assuming like a specific number on the demonstrators? We're not assuming an specific number on the demonstrators, but again, these are empirical. And as I mentioned in the last question, we are assuming like coverage of state and actions. So you might have like 2 demonstrators and then they have like a really good coverage of state and actions, and that is enough. So we're not making any assumptions on how many demonstrators we have. If we have 1 demonstrator, then it's just like the expertise of that 1 demonstrator. We actually have some work where we are learning the confidence measure over the trajectories that are provided by the demonstrator. So you can imagine that 1 demonstrator is providing 10 different demonstrations and they are still suboptimal. but like you might want to be able to learn a confidence over each one of those demonstrations that are given. And a similar type of method, a bi-level optimization type of method, could become like useful there too. But if all the demonstrations are at the same level of expertise, then I guess like you can just learn like that. Right? If all the demonstrations given even by that one demonstrator is at like 60% expertise, we can't really do anything. Like we can just be 60% good. Regarding your second question, that's very interesting. So that's something that we have started thinking about, this idea that, yeah, there's like a lot of variability. If you look at human actions, like when we started looking at some of these human data sets, that's actually when we started seeing these variabilities. Humans have many different ways of like, let's say, pushing an object. And we started seeing more of that in the play like part of the work that I didn't go into details, but there it's actually making a huge effect, like when you're looking at human data, like being very much variable compared to synthetically generated data. I think more expressive models are able to handle that variability. You just learn, like if you have a larger neural network with more parameters, it's able to like learn that variability. But in general, I agree that like our methods are fairly limited when it comes to like capturing those different variabilities that people have. We have some work around learning like a multimodal like reward to capture like human preferences. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to like think about this idea that there are several valid ways of doing something and being able to capture all of them.
Okay, then Arkady either wants to warn us that we are running beyond time, or he has a very short question.
I think the question is moderately short, but the answer probably will be short. So thanks, Dorsa, really interesting talk. I really get triggered by the idea of utilizing the information on the identity of the human, which the data comes from. So this, most of the talk was, I mean, all of the examples were from the context of imitation learning, right? Where the goal is basically to mimic good humans and discard the data from bad humans. But do you envision something like this also being used for learning models that you can use, for instance, for behavior prediction, when you don't really know in the runtime which human you're trying to predict? And if in the past you have data from different humans, could this help somehow?
Yeah, that would be interesting. And I think it would potentially like add like an uncertainty level for your prediction and better, more effective like uncertainty measure for your predictions. Like I would imagine like for behavior modeling of like, for example, how other cars around you drive, like potentially a similar type of model like extended for prediction purposes could be pretty interesting. And we haven't, this IEEE work that I was talking about is under submission even, and we haven't like worked on the prediction side of things, but that would be pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Okay, great. Thanks. So thanks for the talk. Thanks for the answers. I think there would have been more questions, but since we are running out of time, thank you, Dorsa.